Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It is Miss Gooding, and I'm here today to talk about the events that led up to the Civil War during the Antebellum era of 1820 to 1860. To begin, I would like to talk about the Missouri Compromise of 1820. The historical context of the Missouri Compromise is that Americans are moving west. There is a lot of unorganized territory in the middle of our country due to the Louisiana Purchase, and so states are starting to form. States or territories are organizing, they are applying for statehood, and they are being admitted. And so the issue of whether these states are going to be pro-slavery or anti-slavery raises its ugly head. So Missouri applies for statehood as a slave state. Well, the northern states that are anti-slavery, are up in arms because then that upsets the balance between the number of states that are pro-slavery and the number that are anti-slavery. And so to balance this, Maine enters as as a free state. In addition, the Missouri Compromise draws the 3630 line. And so this line was supposed to decide whether slavery would be allowed in certain territories or not. So in future decisions, anything above this line, so north of the line, would be free states, and below would be slave states. This compromise pleased both the North and the South well enough that it worked for a time. The Missouri Compromise was successful. However, in 1850, the southern states threatened to secede, and so there was a need for a new compromise. So the Compromise of 1850 was written. Henry Clay and a handful of other people worked on it, and there were 5 parts to this compromise in order to keep the southern states happy for a short time. So the 5 parts were: number one, California would be entered as a free state, so that pleased the North. The second part of the Compromise of 1850 was that the area from the Mexican Secession, so the um, the land that was won during the Mexican-American War, was divided into Utah and New Mexico, and the slavery issue again, it came up again, and it they decided to allow people to decide, and that's called popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is allowing people to vote and decide on their own. Okay, and so you'll see in a little bit how popular sovereignty can really end badly. Third part of the Compromise of 1850 was that it ended slave trade in Washington, D.C. This pleased the North, and the reason is a lot of people didn't feel that the capital of our country was a good place for slave auctions to occur. It was embarrassing, it wasn't moral, and so they wanted it to be abolished. The fourth part was that it made the Fugitive Slave Law, which already existed, it made it more strict, and we'll get to that in a second. The fifth part of the compromise was that it settled a border dispute between New Mexico and Texas. So when Texas won its independence from Mexico, it drew a larger state than it actually was, and it kind of encroached upon New Mexico's territory. And so the lines for Texas were redrawn, and they received $10 million for the land that then went to New Mexico. So the Compromise of 1850 worked for a short time. It appeased the South, it appeased the North, and the South stopped their threat of secession for about 10 years. All right, a little bit more about the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. So again, this was a part of the Compromise of 1850, but this law already existed. However, it became more strict. So it required citizens to turn escaped slaves in, and if they did not abide by this law, people that aided escaped slaves in any way, could be fined up to $1,000, a ton of money at this point in time in history. And some people even faced jail time. So this was not popular in the North, but the South was very happy about the Fugitive Slave Law because, again, these slaves to them were worth a lot of money. Um, Judges, a part of the Fugitive Slave Law, judges received kickbacks for the decisions that they made. They would receive more money, $10, if they returned a slave to the owner, and $5 if they freed them. So there was some incentive for judges to return escaped slaves. So unfortunately, I don't know the numbers, but a lot of freed blacks were often captured. And if one person swore in front of a judge that the slave was actually not a free man, but a slave, they would be sent back into slavery. And so that was heartbreaking for a lot of people. So again, the North hated it and the South appreciated it. Another nail in the coffin, so to speak, as we're heading toward the Civil War, is the publication of a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was published in 1852 and written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. But this book was essentially, it functioned as a piece of propaganda because it was a piece of fiction. However, it was about a slave and his experiences, and it was heart-wrenching for people to read, and it described the evils of slavery. And in fact, Uncle Tom in the book is whipped to death by his owner. And so when people in the North read this book, it incensed them. And they, were not a fan of slavery, but this book gave them even more reason to hate it. And of course, the South, when they read the book, their response was that it's all lies. Right? So this was another step toward the Civil War. It changed people's hearts about slavery. Another conflict that arose was the passing of the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. It was sponsored by Stephen Douglas of Illinois, but essentially the United States was attempting to build the Transcontinental Railroad. And of course, Stephen Douglas from Illinois, he wanted it to start in Illinois and then go across the country through the Louisiana Territory. But because the Louisiana Territory wasn't necessarily completely settled at this point in time, there was an effort to do so. And so the effort worked this way. They divided the lands into Kansas and Nebraska. And once again, the slavery issue rose its ugly head, and they decided that these two areas would be able to decide for themselves if they were going to be pro or anti-slavery. And so this led to violence, you guys, in a lot of different ways. So first of all, it led to violence in the Senate. There was a lot of anger with regards to this decision. And a man named Charles Sumner, a senator, spoke very strongly against the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And he really upset Preston Brooks. And Preston Brooks was the nephew of one of the men who worked on writing the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And Preston Brooks was so irate, and he talked to his uncle. His uncle's name was Andrew Butler, again, one of the co-authors of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But Preston Brooks returned the next day to the Senate and brought a cane with him and nearly beat Charles Sumner to death on the floor of the Senate. So there was a lot of conflict, you guys. And in addition, people, after this Senate event, this violence in the Senate, people started choosing sides. Some people were sending Preston Brooks canes for Christmas, like, hey, do it again. And some people were rallying around Charles Sumner. And so the division was just becoming deeper and deeper and deeper. So another piece of violence that took place because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act was actually the fact that people started to move into the area with the intent to sway the vote regarding popular sovereignty. And so if people were anti-slavery, they were moving to the area intending to vote against slavery. And they would invite their friends. They would recruit their friends to come and move into this area so that we can, vote this way. And people that were pro-slavery were doing the same thing. And so sometimes in these areas, you would have people that were very, very pro-slavery living right next to people that were anti-slavery. And there was very little governing in this area at this time. It was still pretty wild out west. And so neighbor against neighbor would sometimes battle it out. And this led to something called Bleeding Kansas. In fact, Harriet Beecher Stowe's brother, moved to the Kansas area, and he was very against slavery, he recruited people by promising them new rifles to use against people that were pro-slavery. And so, you just see that this building tension, between, all of these different events, and especially in this area, it led to neighbor against neighbor, and people started battling it out in Kansas. And so that's what's known as Bleeding Kansas, is just this kind of mini civil war within the territory of Kansas. And so Governor John Geary, he sent 1,300 federal troops in order to stop the violence, but it was a crazy time. The Potawatomi Creek killings and John Brown were another step toward the Civil War. So these took place in 1856. John Brown was an abolitionist, and he was especially anti-slavery. He ended up picking up and moving with his sons. He followed his sons out to Kansas, and they decided to roll into a small town, and he went into pro-slavery men. He ended up dragging them out of bed and killing these men in cold blood in the middle of the night. So John Brown communicated with people that he believed that he was doing what God told him to do, and that he had every right to do it, because it was God's message to him to end slavery and to be a part of the movement. And even though it terrified people in the area, many Northerners, they were appalled at him. But a lot of people were rooting it on, and they were also just like, hey, this area of the country is just pretty crazy. So he was a part of that. You'll hear more about him in a minute. All right, another step toward the Civil War was the Dred Scott decision of 1857. So, Dred Scott was a slave. He was owned by an army physician, and this army physician would move um, to do his job from state to state. And they were from Missouri, which was a slave state. And he often would take Dred Scott with him, when he traveled for his work. And so they lived in a free territory for over a year. And, they moved from Missouri to, I can't remember which state. Anyway, one up north. But then after about a year, they moved back there to a slave state. Meanwhile, the owner died. And then after his owner died, Scott had abolitionists approach him with attorneys that they wanted to file a lawsuit on behalf of him, because they claimed that because he had lived in a free state for an extended amount of time, he should be a free man. It went to the Supreme Court. He lost. The court ruled that he was not a citizen, he was property. They also ruled that Congress could not ban slavery in any of the territories. And this, you guys, officially repealed the Missouri Compromise. Because if you think about that line, the 3630 line, where it was supposed to delineate north would have been free states, and south of that line was slave states. Well, the Dred Scott decision basically told people that if they from the South had slaves and they wanted to move to the North, they could do that, and they could bring their slaves with them. So, in essence, yes, it repealed the Missouri Compromise, which very much angered Northerners. In 1858, Lincoln started to follow Stephen Douglas around to debate him. Now, Lincoln had built a name for himself in Illinois. He was very respected, and he was a new and upcoming politician. But he was very clear that he wanted to debate Douglas, because he knew that Douglas was going to be a presidential candidate. So their messages were very different, and Lincoln's message started to very much concern the South. So Douglas believed in deciding slavery by popular sovereignty. Lincoln was totally against it. He believed that slavery should not be allowed to spread into other territories. And he also believed that the nation would split based on this issue. So again, these conversations and these debates very much started to raise the angst in both the North and the South. So John Brown, crazy John Brown, attacks again. And so in 1859, he organizes the raid on Harper's Ferry. So basically, what he does, you guys, is he recruits a handful of blacks and 13 whites into Harper's Ferry, which was a small town, and there was a large arsenal there. They raided the arsenal and they took a whole bunch of weapons, and they wanted to start a slave revolt, a violent slave revolt. However, a lot of slaves were very, very afraid to join in, and so they didn't really heed his call. So a number of his men died, and then, interestingly, Robert E. Lee arrested John Brown. And John Brown was tried in a court of law, and he was found guilty of treason. And so he was later hanged. But for his actions, the North really, even though they were kind of appalled by some of the things that he did, they really did refer to him as a martyr. So the election of 1860 was really the last final straw that broke the camel's back. It was the last nail in the coffin. And after Lincoln won the election of 1860, the South receded. So Lincoln ran against Douglas in the presidential election of 1860. The Southern states didn't like Lincoln. They knew his stance on slavery. They really didn't feel that he represented their best interests. And so Southerners grew very angry. They said it didn't matter what their opinions were, the North had too much power. And so you can see that Lincoln, he won the red states. Douglas didn't do very well, you guys. And then Breckinridge down here. But officially, Southerners started to talk about seceding from the Union after his victory. So the South actually secedes starting in November of 1860. South Carolina was the first state to secede, and then other states started to follow suit. So you can see, and you can always come back and pause this too, but you can see all the dates where the individual states ended up seceding. So again, the first one was South Carolina, but you can see that Texas seceded in February, but really they seceded within a couple months of one another. And these states, okay, so this was the second secession. They kind of went in waves, you guys. So this was the first wave of secessions. The second wave was the yellow, and then there were bordering states that remained neutral. The red states were the ones that stayed in the Union.